Hello everyone, and welcome again to General Psychology, Psychology 101. And today we're going to be talking about ethics in psychology. So when we talk about research in psychology, the possibilities truly are endless. However, there are some guidelines that we have to follow, especially when we're conducting research using human participants. We strive to conduct objective research, but we also, as researchers, strive to conduct moral research. And ideally, we want to protect participants from as much harm as possible. And there are a lot of institutions in place and guidelines in place to not only protect participants, but help researchers to protect the participants in every way they can. So, for example, the CITI, CITI, it's training that people do to familiarize themselves with some of the ethical concerns involved in research on human participants. Other institutions such as the IRB, such as the APA, all in place to ensure that the research that's being conducted within psychology is as ethically sound and morally sound as possible. One of the foundational articles or foundational kind of doctrines of ethical research in psychology is the Belmont Report. And the Belmont Report stresses three very important kind of characteristics of research. That is respect, beneficence, and justice. When we talk about respect, we generally are talking about the fact that research should be voluntary. Participants should actively seek out research. They shouldn't be forced to participate in research in any way, shape, or form. And they should be provided informed consent about what they're about to take part in. So this is kind of stresses the idea of autonomy, that participants are not kind of participating in research without their consent, without their knowledge of what they're about to do. Beneficence stresses this idea of doing good and trying to do no harm as much as possible, stressing the fact that the benefits of research should far outweigh the risks of the participants in that specific situation or specific research experiment. And this could refer to the fact that benefits to the participant should outweigh the risks, but sometimes it can also suggest that benefits to society as a whole could outweigh the risks that the participant is encountering. Lastly is justice, and this is the idea that participants should be properly compensated for their time and efforts in the research. Ideally, participants, again, should be willing to do this on their own. They should be seeking out these opportunities, and they should be rewarded and rightly compensated for what they're doing. And also the research that's being conducted should yield valuable outcomes. It shouldn't be research that isn't going to, in some way, shape, or form, help other people or help us understand human behavior any better. So those are the three main points. So you may be asking yourself, why all this emphasis on ethics? Why are these institutions, why are these doctrines in place in the first place? Well, that's because some people did some very bad stuff in the past. And now, I don't want to say that we're reaping the punishments of it, but we're forced to be a little bit more careful and a little bit more considerate about how we conduct research now in the present. So for example, these Belmont principles, the Belmont Report itself, was a response to a lot of the experimentation on humans that occurred in the Nazi regime in Germany in the mid-20th century. And this is enacted by what's known as the Nuremberg Code. And this was also somewhat a reaction to another study that was conducted in the United States, known as the Tuskegee syphilis study. And in this study, syphilis was given to African American sharecroppers in Alabama without their knowledge or consent to doing this. And researchers basically observed them over a long period of time, over the course of their life, to see how the disease or the virus progressed, to see how syphilis progressed within the human body. This was also replicated using hepatitis in another community known as Willowbrook. So this is obviously not good. People being given an illness, a virus, a disease, without their knowledge, one that will possibly lead to their death, and individuals researching them. So these are examples of some of the institutions that were put into place due to some other research outside of psychology, but there have been instances of psychological research that have led to stricter ethical guidelines being implemented, specifically by the APA, or the American Psychological Association. So we'll talk about some of these studies over the course of the quarter. But for example, obedience studies conducted by Stanley Milgram, where people believe that they were giving shocks to other people. This is an example of something that had to be tamed down. Another experiment had individuals pretend to be prisoners, and another half of participants pretend to be prison guards. This didn't end well, and this is an example of something that had to be tamed down. And the question needs to be asked, yes, we're trying to attain better knowledge of psychology, better knowledge of human behavior and the motivations behind human behavior, but at what cost are we acquiring this knowledge? There has to be a balance between acquiring this knowledge and making sure that we're not causing destruction and damage to people's lives in the process. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, why are some of these research studies being conducted? These are horrible. Why would people even think to do some of these? Well, there are some issues with experiments with research in psychology that a lot of these issues got around. For example, there are issues of reactance. So people oftentimes, if they're aware of the hypothesis of the research, or if they're aware of what researchers or experimenters are trying to do, sometimes they try to disconfirm the hypothesis. They work against the experimenter. That's why we, as researchers, try and not give all the information that we can to the participants right before they start to participate. We want to leave them as blind as possible. We want them to be aware of risks, but as blind as possible going in, so that they are ideally behaving as they would in the real world. Another issue is social desirability. People often give different responses to questions when they can be associated with those responses, when they can be attached to them. So for example, I might ask, if we were in class, I might ask all of you the question, how many of you within the last 24 hours have eaten? All of you would probably raise your hands. There's no reason why you wouldn't respond to this question truthfully. I might ask all of you, how many within the last 24 hours have drank 3 beers? Some of you might be more reluctant to answer that question truthfully. There might be a stigma attached to drinking a lot on, say, a Sunday night, or I guess a Saturday night, depending on what night it is. What if I asked you within the last 24 hours, how many of you have masturbated? Well, probably none of you are going to raise your hand. There's obviously a social stigma attached to masturbating, and you don't want to be the person who has raised your hand to say, hey, yeah, I've masturbated within the last 24 hours, even though you might have. So if we want to, for some reason, conduct a research on masturbation, I don't know why, we would try to avoid some of these social desirability issues in one way, shape, or form. And lastly, people tend to perform better when they know they're being watched, or they perform differently when they know they're being watched by an experimenter. So a lot of times we'll try to avoid this situation by making sure that either experimenters aren't present, or if the experimenter is present, they aren't saying that they're an experimenter. They might pretend to be a different participant in the study. So this kind of suggests that there is some form of deception going on in certain psychological experiments. And deception can be used as a workaround to a lot of these problems that I just outlined. For example, when talking about what participants are about to take part in before a study, a cover story can help divert attention away from the true purpose of the study. We can't go too crazy with the cover story. We need to be truthful to a certain extent, but we just don't divulge enough details or all the details so that people know exactly what we're going to be examining. If a cover story is used, then participants have to be debriefed about the true nature of the story and exactly what they did in the study after they've completed the study. So that way, they are well informed and know exactly what they did over the course of the study. Sometimes in psychological research, there can be some risks involved. We do want to minimize risks as much as possible, but sometimes, due to the nature of research, there has to be some risk involved. Ideally, we want to aim for minimal risks. That means that the risks involved are no different from daily life. These can involve answering certain questions in surveys, certain problem-solving tasks, etc. Sometimes there are larger risks involved. That can include possible physical or emotional harm. So that can include electrical shocks, that can include feeling rejected by peers, that can include a cold presser, that's basically taking your hand and dipping it into a large vat of ice water. to inflict a little bit of pain. And mostly all of these forms of risks or pain or emotional pain try to be as minimal as possible. They don't want to hurt the participants. Another form of risk that isn't necessarily physical or emotional harm is identifiable data. Ideally, we want to, as researchers, to separate the identity of a participant from their responses. And this is fairly simple to do when conducting just a one-off research experiment, but when we start to conduct research that basically is assessing the same participant multiple times over a period of time, we have to be able to make sure that we're assessing the same participant in the same way over and over again and are attaching the data to the same participant in every experiment. So in a sense, we have to be able to identify that participant and connect them to the data. There are ways of getting around this being identifiable by keeping the specific names of the people attached to codes and then attaching the codes to the data and keeping those two files separate. But this is a risk that we as researchers have to consider when conducting certain types of research, specifically longitudinal research. So who oversees all of these issues? Who makes sure that every single research experiment is following through on these ethical concerns, are not initiating a large amount of risk, are making sure that all the participants are well informed, et cetera, et cetera? Well, this is generally overseen by the Institutional Research Board, or IRB. This is a committee that oversees all federally funded research involving human participants and is generally consisted of a diverse faculty at university settings. These do sometimes exist in more business settings, business research facilities, and these are consisted of some of the higher ups in that business. And these committees evaluate the ethical treatment of participants in every single research study. And any research experiments has to get IRB approval before they start collecting data, before they start running participants. So these ethical concerns are extremely important to keep in mind when thinking about research in general. So that's all for today. Thank you again for your time and attention, and I will see you later. Bye-bye.